My family said I failed. I sat quietly at my sister's court-martial. Then the judge looked up, paused, and said, "Wait, you're—" The room froze. Even my father lowered his head. If you've ever been the one they forgot to mention at dinner, if your name got skipped when success stories got told, drop a comment. Let me know you're listening. Sometimes knowing someone else understands makes the truth easier to speak out loud. My name is Megan Price, middle daughter, maintenance corps, the one they called a mechanic with rank. I wasn't cut out for glory. I was built to keep the lights on when things went dark. Growing up Price meant growing up military. My father, Colonel James Price, retired Air Force. My mother, Susan, former combat nurse, who wore her silence like another medal. My older brother, Marcus, serves naval intelligence. And Rachel, my younger sister, she's the Air Force pilot. The media favorite the one whose face gets shared on social media, with captions like "Women in Combat" and "Breaking Barriers." Then there's me, Army Corps of Engineers, the daughter who enlisted instead of commissioning, the one who chose dirt and wires over dress blues and ceremony. I served in Afghanistan, Korea, places where the power grid meant the difference between a functioning base and a graveyard. I specialized in electrical infrastructure, explosive ordnance disposal, UAV diagnostics work that happened in the background while others took the stage. No fanfare, no press coverage, just mission continuity. They called me a glorified janitor, even when I kept Rachel's bases from turning into death traps. I carry a navy blue folder everywhere, thick with schematics, safety reports, emergency repair protocols. At family gatherings, they mistake it for administrative paperwork, something a secretary might carry. That folder holds blueprints that saved lives. But to them it looked like clerical clutter. Rachel posts photos from her cockpit helmet, gleaming horizons stretched behind her like a promise. The comments pour in. Hero, inspiration, role model. I post nothing. My work happens in bunkers and under runways, in places where cameras don't follow and reporters don't visit. If you've ever been the invisible one, if your wins were too quiet for the dinner table, this story's for you. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the same person holding everything together. Sometimes the daughter they forget to mention is the one who wrote the safety protocols that keep their golden child alive. And sometimes, just sometimes, the truth finds its voice in the last place anyone expects to hear it. In a courtroom. Under oath. When the judge recognizes a name that should have been spoken at every family dinner for the past 10 years. My family thought I failed because I never learned to make noise about my success. They were about to discover that silence and failure aren't the same thing. Not even close. The Price family dinner table was a battlefield disguised as mahogany. Every Sunday at 1800 hours sharp. That's how my father ran things, military precision applied to pot roast and mashed potatoes. We'd sit in formation, Dad at the head, Mom to his right, Marcus across from her, Rachel beside him. Me at the foot facing my father like I was reporting for duty. The conversations followed a pattern. Dad would start with Marcus' latest intelligence briefings. He could discuss commendations from superior officers' speculation about his next assignment. Marcus always had something impressive to share. Classified, of course, but he'd hint around the edges enough to make everyone lean forward. Then Rachel. God, Rachel could make reading the phone book sound like she'd just landed on the moon. Fighter pilot training solo flights, the time she pulled 7 Gs and didn't black out. Her Instagram followers loved her helmet selfies and cockpit videos. 200,000 people hanging on every post about breaking barriers and reaching for the sky. Mom would beam. Dad would nod with that particular brand of military pride that made his chest expand half an inch. Then they'd turn to me. How's work, Megan? Work. Never service. Never deployment. Just work like I punched a time clock at some office building. Fine, I'd say, cutting my meat with surgical precision. And that was it. Conversation moved on. Whether local news gossip from the base wives club. They never asked what kind of work. Never wondered why I carried that navy blue folder everywhere, why my hands were permanently stained with electrical residue, why I sometimes woke up checking my phone for emergency calls that might not come. The folder sat beside my plate every Sunday, thick with documentation they couldn't understand and didn't care to learn about. Safety protocols for power grid reconstruction, emergency repair procedures for UAV systems, schematics for explosive ordnance disposal in hostile territory. To them it looked like paperwork, Administrative nonsense. Still carrying your little briefcase everywhere, Rachel said once, cutting into her potatoes. It's not like you're handling state secrets, Meg. I set down my fork, looked at her directly. How do you think the lights stay on at Bagram? I asked. She blinked. What? When mortars hit the electrical grid. When the backup generators fail. When your fighter jets need power to fuel up for the next sortie. Who do you think fixes that? Silence stretched across the table like a taut wire. Dad cleared his throat. We're proud of all our children's service. All. Like it was equal. Like Rachel's Instagram-ready heroics, and my invisible infrastructure work carried the same weight in their eyes. After dinner, Marcus would linger for coffee and war stories. Rachel would FaceTime with fellow pilots, their laughter echoing from the living room. Mom would wash dishes while Dad retreated to his study to read military history. I'd sit on the back porch with my folder reviewing safety reports by the light of the kitchen window. Alone. The worst part wasn't the dismissal. It was the casual way they edited me out of family success stories. At neighborhood barbecues, Dad would introduce Marcus as my son in naval intelligence and Rachel as my daughter, the fighter pilot. When people asked about me, he'd pause just for a heartbeat, then say, and Megan's in the Army. No specialization, no accomplishments. Just in the Army, like I was still in basic training instead of having spent 3 tours keeping critical infrastructure operational in combat zones. Rachel's promotion ceremonies got posted on Facebook with full photo albums. Her first solo flight made it into the local newspaper. When she graduated from advanced tactical training, Mom called all her sisters to spread the news. When I returned from Afghanistan after rebuilding the electrical grid for an entire forward operating base work that took 4 months in 120-degree heat, while dodging sniper fire, they picked me up from the airport with casual hugs and asked if I was hungry. No photos, no Facebook posts, no phone calls to relatives. How was your deployment? Mom asked on the drive home. Productive, I said, watching familiar streets blur past the window. That's nice, honey. The navy blue folder sat on my lap, heavy with after-action reports that detailed how my team's work had prevented 3 separate blackouts that could have compromised base security. Inside were commendations from base commanders, testimonials from medical personnel, whose equipment stayed online because of my electrical repairs, photographs of infrastructure projects that kept thousands of service members safe. But they never asked to see inside. They never asked about the time I crawled through a collapsed maintenance tunnel to restore power to the trauma unit during a rocket attack. Never heard about the UAV diagnostic system I designed that reduced reconnaissance mission failures by 30%. Never knew that other bases requested me by name because my emergency protocols had become the gold standard for rapid repair in combat zones. To them, I was still the middle daughter who chose enlisted over officer. Still the one who worked with her hands instead of commanding with her voice. Still the mechanic with rank. I started leaving the folder closed during family dinners, not because I was ashamed of its contents, but because I got tired of carrying invisible weight. Sometimes the heaviest burden isn't what you're holding. It's knowing that no one else can see you're holding anything at all. The call came at 0547 on a Tuesday morning. I was already awake reviewing grid schematics for a consulting project in my kitchen. Coffee growing cold, navy blue folder open beside my laptop. The phone's buzz cut through the quiet like an alarm. Megan, my father's voice. No greeting, no pleasantries. Pure military efficiency. We need to talk. I set down my pen. In 28 years, he'd never called me before 0800 unless someone was dead or deployed. What happened? A pause, the kind that carries weight. Rachel's in trouble. I waited. With my father, information came in measured doses. Court-martial, he said. Drone strike went wrong. Civilian casualties. She's been charged with overriding safety protocols. The words hung in the air like smoke. I thought of Rachel's Instagram posts, cockpit shots, sunset flights, captions about precision and honor. The golden daughter who could do no wrong. When I asked, Thursday, 1400 hours, you should come. Should. Not needed, not wanted. Should. Of course, I said. Another pause. Then the part that cut deeper than the news itself. Megan, don't wear anything with rank. We don't want to confuse the room. Confuse the room? As if my presence in uniform might somehow complicate things. as if the decorated service member in the family was Rachel, not the maintenance corps specialist, who'd spent 3 tours keeping bases operational. Understood, I said. Good. We'll see you there? The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen staring at the schematics spread across the table. Electrical grid layouts, safety protocols, emergency procedures. The invisible architecture that kept everything running. The work that happened in shadows while others took the spotlight. Civilian casualties from overriding safety protocols. I knew what that meant. Someone had ignored warnings. Someone had pushed past automated safeguards. Someone had decided mission completion mattered more than procedural caution. I opened my laptop and pulled up Rachel's service record, the public portions anyway. Commendations, flight hours, training certifications. Impressive by any standard. But I also pulled up something else. My own mission reports from the last 2 years. Cross-reference dates when I'd been deployed to the same theater as Rachel's squadron. The reports contained technical recommendations I'd submitted through proper channels. Recommendations about UAV navigation systems, about communication protocols during drone operations, about safety margins for civilian areas. The navy blue folder held copies of everything. I packed methodically, civilian clothes as instructed. Navy slacks, white blouse, minimal jewelry. The uniform stayed in the closet, dress blues, hanging like a ghost of service my family preferred not to acknowledge. But the folder came with me. It always did. The drive to the base took 4 hours. 4 hours to think about Rachel, about protocols, about the weight of command decisions made in split seconds, about civilian casualties and safety overrides, and the mathematics of warfare that happened beyond public view. I didn't come for vengeance. I came to witness. Whatever Rachel had done, whatever choices led to this moment, she was still my sister. Still the little girl who used to beg me to let her help with my science projects, who cried when I left for basic training, who sent care packages during my first deployment, even though she never asked what I actually needed. The base entrance hadn't changed. Same guard shack, same concrete barriers, same sense of institutional permanence. I pulled up to the checkpoint and handed over my driver's license. The MP scanned it without recognition. Just another civilian visiting for official business. Purpose of visit: court-martial proceedings. Family member. He checked his list, found my name, handed me a visitor's badge. Generic white plastic with my name typed in standard font. No special designation, no acknowledgement of prior service, no indication I'd ever set foot on a military installation before. Parking lot C, Building 47. Security will direct you from there. Thank you. I clipped the badge to my blouse and drove to the designated lot. Around me, service members moved with familiar purpose, crisp uniforms, purposeful strides, the choreography of military life I'd once been part of. Now I was just another civilian observer. Building 47 was standard military architecture, functional, imposing, designed to remind everyone inside that this was serious business. I followed signs to the courtroom presenting my visitor's badge to security personnel, who barely glanced at my face. Inside, the seating was arranged by proximity to the proceedings. Front rows for legal counsel and official observers. Middle sections for command personnel and key witnesses. Back rows for family members and general observers. They seated me in the last row. To my left sat an elderly woman clutching a tissue, someone else's mother, someone else's family crisis. To my right, a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit checking his phone repeatedly. We were the civilian gallery, the people who mattered just enough to be present but not enough to be acknowledged. I placed the navy blue folder on my lap and waited. The courtroom filled slowly, officers in dress uniform, legal personnel with briefcases, administrative staff with clipboards. Each person had a role, a reason for being there, a specific relationship to the proceedings. I had a reason too. Just one nobody recognized. The woman beside me leaned over. "Are you family?" she whispered. "Sister," I said. She nodded sympathetically. "It's hard, isn't it, watching them go through this?" I looked down at the folder in my lap. Inside were safety protocols, technical specifications, and maintenance reports. Documentation of work that happened in silence, decisions that saved lives, warnings that went unheeded. "Yes," I said. "It is." "All rise." The bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Everyone stood in unison, a wave of dress uniforms and civilian clothes, all facing the bench where military justice would unfold. Judge Colonel Patricia Hayes entered with the measured pace of someone who'd presided over dozens of these proceedings. Silver hair pulled back severely, ribbons on her chest, telling their own story of service and sacrifice. She took her seat and we followed suit. "Be seated." From my position in the last row, I watched Rachel enter through the side door. She looked magnificent. Dress blues, immaculate ribbons aligned with geometric precision, posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Even facing court-martial, she carried herself like the golden daughter everyone expected her to be. She sat at the defendant's table, spine, straight, hands folded. Every inch the professional warrior. The charges were read with bureaucratic precision. "Captain Rachel Price, you are charged with neglect of safety warnings in violation of Article 92 and unlawful authorization of an unmanned strike, resulting in civilian casualties in violation of Article 86. Civilian casualties." The words hung in the air like an indictment of everything military service was supposed to prevent. Rachel's defense attorney rose, a sharp-featured man with the kind of confidence that came from winning difficult cases. He painted a picture of a dedicated officer faced with impossible decisions, outdated equipment, and systematic failures beyond her control. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began. Captain Price operated within the parameters of her training and the information available to her. The tragic civilian casualties resulted not from negligence, but from a cascading series of technical failures. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the navy blue folder. "The drone's navigation system experienced a critical malfunction," the attorney continued. "Safety protocols that should have been updated months prior to the mission remained outdated in the system database." My breath caught. "Someone in engineering," he said, his voice carrying the weight of accusation, "failed to update critical safety protocols. Captain Price made her decisions based on what the system told her was accurate current information." The room was silent except for the scratch of court stenographer keys and the whisper of papers being shuffled. But inside my chest something was screaming. I had written those updates 6 months ago after identifying critical flaws in the UAV navigation interface during a routine systems audit. I'd flagged the failure points, documented the risks, submitted detailed recommendations through proper channels. The memo had been distributed to all relevant personnel, including Rachel. I'd sent it directly to her unit, had watched the read receipt confirm delivery, had even followed up with a brief email asking if she needed clarification on any of the technical specifications. She'd never responded. The defense attorney was still talking, weaving a narrative of systemic failure and individual heroism. Rachel sat motionless, her expression carefully neutral, professional, controlled. But I saw the way her hands pressed against each other just a fraction too tightly. The way her jaw set when the attorney mentioned engineering failures. She knew. Judge Hayes listened without visible emotion, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. During a brief recess, I watched her review a thick file of documents, case materials, personnel records, witness lists. Later I would learn what happened during that review, how her eyes had stopped on a particular name in the attendee roster, Price Megan, former staff sergeant, Corps of Engineers. How she'd stared at that entry for a full 30 seconds, her mind reaching back through years of service records and mission reports. How recognition had dawned slowly then, all at once. She'd known that name. Known it from briefings, from after-action reports from a particular operation that had saved lives when everything else was falling apart. But she'd said nothing, not yet. When court resumed, the prosecution called their first technical witness, a systems analyst who'd examined the drone's flight recorder. He spoke in measured tones about navigation failures, protocol violations, and the margin for error in combat operations. Then the judge did something unexpected. "I'd like to call Megan Price to provide technical testimony regarding UAV safety protocols." The words hit the courtroom like a shockwave. Every head turned. Rachel's attorney half rose from his chair, then thought better of it. My father, sitting 3 rows ahead of me, went rigid in his seat. I stood slowly, the navy blue folder clutched against my chest. The walk to the witness stand felt like crossing a minefield, every step measured, every eye in the room tracking my movement. I was sworn in with the same oath that had bound my service for years. Truth, justice, constitutional obligations, words that had shaped my life even when my family couldn't see it. Judge Hayes looked at me directly. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was something else there too. Recognition, maybe. Or confirmation of a suspicion. Please state your name and military background for the record. Megan Price, former Staff Sergeant, Army Corps of Engineers, 3 tours specializing in electrical infrastructure and UAV diagnostic systems. The judge's pen stopped moving across her notepad. She looked up slowly, her gaze locking with mine. Wait, she said, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. You're the Megan Price Kandahar blackout. Silence. Not the polite quiet of a courtroom proceeding, but absolute suffocating silence. The kind that follows when someone speaks a truth that changes everything. I saw Rachel's hands clench against the defendant's table, saw my father's head lower as if the weight of recognition was too heavy to bear, saw the defense attorney's confident expression crack just slightly around the edges. Yes, ma'am, I said quietly. Judge Hayes leaned back in her chair, and for just a moment the mask of judicial neutrality slipped. In its place was something that looked like respect. The Kandahar operation, she said, not really a question. When the power grid failed during the offensive, you restored electrical systems to the trauma unit while under direct fire. Yes, ma'am. 3 hours in a collapsed maintenance tunnel, saved 47 critical patients. I nodded. The judge looked down at her notes, then back at me. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of military tradition, the acknowledgement of service that transcends rank and recognition. Staff Sergeant Price, she said, I believe you have something to tell this court about UAV safety protocols. I opened the navy blue folder. For the first time in my life, everyone in the room was ready to listen. I opened the navy blue folder on the witness stand. Inside, beneath layers of technical schematics and safety reports, were my mission logs. Handwritten entries in black ink, each one a snapshot of work that happened in shadows, while others took the light. Judge Hayes waited. The courtroom held its breath. I pulled out the first entry and read aloud mission log, October 18, 2016, Falbi Kandahar, 0347 hours. The words carried me back. Sand in my teeth, the smell of diesel fuel and cordite, the particular weight of silence that comes just before everything goes wrong. Mortars dropped power at 400. Direct hit on primary transformer. ICU lost backup systems at Orofar 003. Trauma unit went dark with 47 critical patients on life support. I could see it again. The way the lights flickered once, then died. The sound of ventilators going quiet. The surgeon's voice cutting through the darkness. Someone get me power or these people die. I had 42 minutes to rebuild the feed lines before backup batteries failed completely. Crawled through collapsed maintenance tunnel under mortar fire. Temperature inside 127 degrees. Got it done in 38 minutes. What I didn't write in that log, how the tunnel had caved in behind me, trapping me with live electrical cables and the sound of explosions overhead. How I'd worked by flashlight, hands bleeding from metal shards, while medics above me tried to keep people alive with manual ventilation. How I'd emerged covered in dust and burns, and the first thing anyone said was, "Good work, Sergeant." Not heroic, just good work. 3 medevac choppers lifted at Eurofar 4-1. No one died that night. Mission complete. I set down the first log and reached for another. This one was more recent, the ink still sharp against the paper. Mission log, March 15, 2020. Osan Air Base, Korea. Remote sensor grid maintenance. Rachel straightened in her chair. She knew this date. Navigation relay system flagged multiple repeat faults during routine diagnostic. Pattern indicates cascade failure risk during high-stress operations. Civilian proximity sensors showing 23% accuracy degradation. I could feel the judge's attention sharpen, but I kept reading. Immediate protocol updates required for all UAV operations in populated areas. Safety margins insufficient for current engagement parameters. Recommend immediate stand-down until repairs completed. The courtroom was silent except for my voice reading words I'd written 6 months ago. Words that should have prevented the tragedy that brought us all here. Technical memo drafted and distributed through proper channels. Recipients include Base Operations UAV Command Squadron leaders. Direct copy sent to Captain Rachel Price, 47th Fighter Squadron. I looked up from the log. Rachel's face had gone pale, but her expression remained controlled. Professional to the end. Memo transmission confirmed 1547 hours. Read receipt received 1612 hours. Follow-up requested via secure email. No response received. Judge Hayes made a note on her pad. Staff Sergeant Price, do you have a copy of this memo? Yes, ma'am. I reached deeper into the folder and withdrew a document marked with official classification headers. As I handed it to the bailiff, I caught sight of Rachel's hands. They were pressed flat against the table, now knuckles white with tension. The memo made its way to the judge, who reviewed it with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to parsing technical documentation for legal significance. This memo, Judge Hayes said, details specific risks associated with navigation system failures in civilian areas. Yes, ma'am. The relay faults created a 17-second delay in target acquisition updates. In urban environments, that delay could result in civilian casualties if engagement protocols weren't adjusted accordingly. I pulled out another log, this one from just 2 months after the Korea deployment. Mission log, May 3, 2020. Technical consultation Operation Sand Tiger. This entry was shorter, more clinical. Received urgent request for technical support from 47th Fighter Squadron. Navigation system experiencing intermittent anomalies during combat operations. Diagnosis confirmed previous findings from March maintenance report. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Rachel's unit had called me when their system started failing, but they'd ignored my warnings about why they were failing in the first place. Recommended immediate operational pause pending system updates. Request denied by Field Command. Mission priority overrides safety protocols. Notation strong objection registered by technical staff. I set down the log and looked directly at Rachel for the first time since taking the stand. I tried to ground those drones, I said quietly. Not because I wanted to interfere with operations, but because I knew people would die if we didn't fix the problems first. Rachel's attorney stood halfway up, then sat back down. There was no objection to make. The documents spoke for themselves. Judge Hayes reviewed the timeline laid out in my mission logs. March problem identified and reported. May problem worsened, repairs still ignored. August civilian casualties during a drone strike, involving the exact navigation failures I'd documented months earlier. Staff Sergeant Price, the judge said, in your professional opinion, could these civilian casualties have been prevented? I thought about all the invisible work, all the warnings that went unheeded, all the protocols that were ignored because they came from someone who didn't wear the right uniform or carry the right rank. Yes, ma'am. If the safety updates had been implemented as recommended, the navigation system would have maintained target accuracy within acceptable parameters. The civilian casualties were a direct result of the system failures I documented in March. The judge made several more notes, then looked up at me with something that might have been respect. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. That will be all. I gathered my logs and returned to my seat in the last row. But something had shifted in the room's dynamic. The civilian observer had become a key witness. The invisible sister had become the expert who'd tried to prevent a tragedy. Rachel didn't look at me as I walked past her table. She didn't have to. We both knew what my testimony meant. The golden daughter had fallen to earth, and the one they'd called a glorified janitor had just explained why. The prosecution called me back to the stand after the lunch recess. By then, the courtroom had taken on a different energy. Word had spread during the break: the invisible sister, the Kandahar hero, the engineer who'd tried to prevent this whole tragedy. Officers who'd barely glanced at me that morning now watched my every movement. Staff Sergeant Price, the prosecutor began, I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit 14, the technical memo you referenced in your earlier testimony. The memo appeared on the courtroom's display screen. My words, written in the precise language of engineering reports, suddenly magnified for everyone to see. Urgent navigation relay system failure. Immediate action required. Date: March 15, 2020. From Staff Sergeant Megan Price. Corps of Engineers to UAV Operations Command. Squadron leaders. Classification for official use. Only executive summary: critical navigation relay faults detected during routine maintenance. Civilian proximity sensors degraded to 77% accuracy. Recommend immediate operational pause for all UAV missions in populated areas. I read the technical specifications aloud, translating the engineering jargon into language the court could understand. Sensor degradation, targeting delays, margin for error calculations that had been exceeded by dangerous percentages. But it was the distribution list that made Rachel's defense attorney shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You sent this memo directly to Captain Price's unit?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes, sir. Along with 17 other recipients in the operational chain." "And did you receive any response from Captain Price?" "No, sir. I sent a follow-up email 3 days later, requesting clarification on implementation timeline. That also went unanswered." The prosecutor pulled up another document, email logs from the base server. "According to these records, Captain Price opened your memo at 16:12 hours on March 15th. She spent 4 minutes and 37 seconds viewing the document. Is that sufficient time to understand the safety implications?" I looked at the timestamp at the digital proof of Rachel's awareness, 4.5 minutes, long enough to read every word, to understand every warning, to grasp the consequences of ignoring them. "Yes, sir. The executive summary clearly states the risks. Any pilot with Captain Price's experience would understand the implications." "And what were those implications?" "That continuing UAV operations with degraded navigation systems would likely result in civilian casualties." The words hung in the courtroom like an indictment. Rachel's attorney stood for cross-examination, but his questions felt desperate. He tried to paint me as a disgruntled sibling, as someone with incomplete information, as a technical specialist who didn't understand operational realities. I answered each question calmly, factually. Let the documentation speak for itself. Then the prosecutor presented the piece of evidence that sealed Rachel's fate, a duty roster from the day she'd ignored my warnings. "Staff Sergeant Price, are you familiar with the visit by General Morrison to Captain Price's base on March 18th? "I'm aware of it, yes. According to flight records, Captain Price authorized a UAV mission on that date, despite your technical recommendations. In your opinion, why might an officer choose to override safety protocols during a high-visibility visit?" Rachel's attorney objected, but Judge Hayes allowed the question. I looked at Rachel across the courtroom. She sat perfectly still, but I could see the truth in her eyes. The same competitive drive that had made her the golden daughter, the same need to excel that had pushed her to ignore warnings she knew were valid. "In my experience," I said carefully, "officers sometimes prioritize mission success over procedural caution when their performance is being evaluated by superior officers." It was a diplomatic way of saying what everyone in the room understood. Rachel had chosen to impress visiting brass rather than ground her drones for safety repairs. The civilian casualties had happened 2 weeks later during another high-stakes mission. Another opportunity to demonstrate tactical brilliance. Another chance to choose glory over caution. The deliberation lasted 3 hours. When the court reconvened, Judge Hayes read the verdict with the same measured precision she'd maintained throughout the trial. "On the charge of neglect of safety warnings, we find the defendant guilty." Rachel's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "On the charge of unlawful authorization resulting in civilian casualties, we find the defendant guilty." The sentencing followed immediately. Judge Hayes spoke directly to Rachel, her voice carrying the weight of military justice. "Captain Price, you were entrusted with advanced weapon systems and the lives of both service members and civilians. You received clear, specific warnings about system failures that posed unacceptable risks. You chose to ignore those warnings." Rachel stood at attention, accepting the judgment with the same professional composure she'd maintained throughout the trial. "You are hereby sentenced to a formal letter of reprimand to be placed in your permanent service record. You are suspended from all command duties, effective immediately. Your flight status is revoked indefinitely. You will be reassigned to technical operations and safety retraining under direct oversight." The final blow came with bureaucratic precision. "Your promotion eligibility is frozen for 5 years. During this period, you will study the very protocols you chose to ignore." The gavel fell with finality. I watched Rachel's hands tremble slightly as she signed the documents, acknowledging her sentence. The golden daughter grounded. The fighter pilot relegated to technical operations, the kind of work her family had always dismissed as beneath notice. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd be spending the next 5 years doing exactly what I'd been doing all along, the invisible work that kept people alive. As the courtroom emptied, I gathered my materials slowly. The navy blue folder felt lighter somehow, as if revealing its contents had released some of the weight I'd been carrying. Rachel's attorney approached her table, speaking in low, urgent tones about appeals and mitigating circumstances. Rachel listened with the same careful attention she'd once applied to flight briefings. I walked past them without speaking. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said under oath. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt different, cleaner somehow. I stood on the steps for a moment, breathing air that didn't taste of institutional justice and family disappointment. A few officers passed by, some nodding acknowledgement of my testimony, others looking away with the discomfort of people who'd witnessed something they hadn't expected. It wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. Not because I'd brought Rachel down, but because the system had finally seen what it chose to overlook. The invisible work, the quiet warnings, the technical expertise that had been dismissed as clerical clutter. Rachel would survive this. She was still a Price, still a pilot, still someone who understood the weight of command, even if she'd made the wrong choice. But she'd never again be able to pretend that the work happening in shadows didn't matter. That was worth more than any apology. I found him waiting by my rental car in the visitor parking lot. My father stood with his back to me, hands clasped behind him in the at ease position that had become second nature over 30 years of service. He was staring across the base toward the flight line, where jets sat silent in their hangars. I approached slowly, my footsteps on the gravel, the only sound between us. "Megan." He didn't turn around when he spoke my name, just continued staring at those grounded aircraft as if they held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Dad." We stood in silence for a moment. The kind of quiet that comes loaded with 28 years of missed conversations and unspoken assumptions. Finally, he turned to face me. His eyes looked older than they had that morning, carved deeper by the weight of recognition that had settled over him during the trial. "We should have asked," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, like the words were scraping against something in his throat. "About you, about your work." I set down the navy blue folder and leaned against the car. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun. "Asked what exactly?" He gestured vaguely toward the courthouse behind us, toward the building, where my invisible service had finally been made visible. "What you did? Where you served? What?" He paused, struggling with words that should have come naturally to a career military officer. "What you accomplished." I studied his face, the same stern features that had presided over family dinners, the same expression that had dismissed my work as fine for so many years. "You didn't want to know," I said quietly. "You wanted me small enough to manage." The words hung between us like a barrier. "That's not," he started to object, then stopped. His shoulders sagged slightly. "Maybe that's true." It was the closest thing to an admission I'd ever heard from him. "It was easier," I continued, "to think of me as the daughter who couldn't handle officer training. The one who chose enlisted because she wasn't good enough for better. It fit the story you wanted to tell about your family." He nodded slowly, as if each word was a weight he was learning to carry. "The Kandahar operation," he said. "When did that happen?" "October 2016. "You never told us. You never asked." Another stretch of silence. A cargo plane rumbled overhead, coming in for landing. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. The words should have meant everything. For years I'd waited to hear them, but standing there in the parking lot, they felt hollow. Too little too late, and earned only through public recognition rather than private understanding. "I know," I said. He reached out as if to touch my shoulder, then let his hand fall back to his side. "What happens now?" I picked up the navy blue folder, suddenly feeling its familiar weight. "Now I go back to my life. The same work, the same purpose. The only thing that's changed is that you finally know what that means." He nodded, though I could see he wanted to say more. Instead, he walked away with the measured pace of a man carrying new understanding he wasn't sure how to bear. I was loading my car when Rachel appeared. She moved across the parking lot with none of her usual military bearing. No confident stride, no perfectly aligned posture. Just a woman in wrinkled dress blues, carrying something that looked suspiciously familiar. My navy blue folder. She stopped a few feet from my car, close enough to speak without raising her voice, but far enough to maintain the distance that had always existed between us. "You left this," she said, holding out the folder. I looked at it more closely. The edges were worn from handling, and I could see papers sticking out at odd angles. Notes had been written in the margins of documents. Question marks penciled next to technical specifications. "That's not mine," I said. "It's a copy. I had someone in admin reproduce everything from your testimony." Took them 3 hours to get all the formatting right. She set the folder on my car's hood and stepped back. I've been reading it, all of it. The mission logs, the technical reports, the safety recommendations. Her voice was steady, but I could hear something new in it. Humility, maybe, or recognition. Rachel, I want to learn, she said, cutting me off. Not because they told me to. Not because it's part of my sentence. Because you did what I didn't. I stared at her. The golden daughter asking to learn from the invisible sister. What I did was my job. No, she shook her head. What you did was right. What I did was, she paused searching for words. What I did was choose glory over safety. Choose advancement over responsibility. The admission settled between us like something fragile. I ignored your warnings because they came from you, she continued. Because accepting them would have meant admitting that my little sister, the one who couldn't cut it at officer school, knew something I didn't. The truth of it was both painful and liberating. I can't undo what happened, she said, but I can learn to do better if you'll teach me. I looked at the modified folder on my car hood, at the evidence of hours spent trying to understand work she'd dismissed for years, at my sister stripped of rank and confidence, asking for help from someone she'd spent a lifetime overlooking. I didn't say yes. I didn't offer forgiveness or sisterly comfort. Instead, I reached into my car and pulled out a white hard hat from my consulting gear. Standard safety equipment scuffed from use, nothing glamorous about it. I held it out to her. Training depot opens at 0700, I said. Wear this, bring work gloves, and Rachel. She looked up from the hard hat, hope flickering in her eyes. Leave the attitude at home. The electrical grid doesn't care about your flight hours. She nodded, clutching the hard hat like it was a lifeline. For the first time in our lives, my little sister was ready to follow my lead. 3 weeks later, I stood at the podium in Conference Room Alpha at Fort Campbell. The invitation had come through official channels, a request from Base Command, to lead a training symposium on technical safeguards in drone warfare. The kind of recognition that should have felt like vindication, but instead felt like responsibility. The room was packed. Base commanders in the front row, their ribbons catching the fluorescent light. Engineering Corps personnel scattered throughout the middle sections, notepads ready. Ethics officers along the sides, faces serious with the weight of preventing future tragedies. And in the front row, third seat from the left, sat Rachel. She wore her dress uniform, but something about her posture had changed. The rigid confidence was gone, replaced by the careful attention of someone learning to listen, rather than waiting to speak. I set the navy blue folder on the podium and looked out at the assembled faces. I used to think silence was loyalty, I began. The room settled into the kind of quiet that comes when people recognize they're about to hear something important. I thought keeping my head down, doing my job without fanfare, letting others take credit, I thought that was what good soldiers did. But silence is how we build shadows, big enough to trip over. A few heads nodded. Others leaned forward. I'm not here to be thanked. I'm here so no one else has to rebuild what we already knew. I opened the first slide of my presentation, a technical diagram of UAV navigation systems, the same components I'd been maintaining and monitoring for years. 3 months ago, civilian casualties occurred during a drone operation. Those casualties were preventable. Not because of better luck or different timing, but because of existing protocols that were ignored. The room was absolutely still. I walked through the technical failures methodically. Navigation relay degradation, sensor accuracy decline. The cascade of system failures that had been documented, reported, and ultimately disregarded. Midway through the presentation, I set aside the slides and opened the navy blue folder. Inside was the original safety memo, the one I'd sent 6 months earlier. The one that could have prevented everything. I laid it flat on the podium, its official headers visible to the front row. This memo details specific risks associated with continuing operations during system degradation, I said. It was distributed to operational command and squadron leaders 6 months before the incident. I didn't name Rachel, didn't need to. The truth spoke for itself. The memo contained 3 recommendations: immediate operational pause system repairs and updated engagement protocols for urban environments. Implementation of these recommendations would have required grounding UAV operations for approximately 72 hours. A colonel in the second row raised his hand. Staff Sergeant, in your opinion, why weren't these recommendations implemented? I looked out at the room full of officers at the faces representing every level of military hierarchy. Some genuinely curious, others defensive. A few already calculating how this information would affect their own operations. In my experience, I said carefully, technical recommendations are sometimes viewed as obstacles to mission success, rather than tools for mission safety. There's pressure to maintain operational tempo, especially during high visibility periods. The unspoken truth hung in the air: people died because someone chose glory over caution. The goal of this symposium isn't to assign blame. It's to ensure that technical expertise is integrated into operational decision-making before tragedies occur, not after. I spent the next hour walking them through protocols, decision trees, and communication systems designed to prevent the kind of cascade failure that had led us here. The invisible work made visible, given the institutional weight it should have carried all along. During the break, Rachel approached the podium. "Thank you," she said quietly. I looked at her, really looked. The hard hat I'd given her 3 weeks earlier had left its mark. Her hands bore the calluses of someone learning to work with tools instead of just weapons. Her uniform was immaculate as always, but there was something different in her eyes. Humility, maybe, or understanding. "How's the retraining going?" I asked. "Hard," she said. "Good hard, though. I'm learning things I should have known years ago," she paused, then added, "I'm learning how much I didn't know. It was the kind of admission that would have been impossible 3 weeks earlier. When the symposium ended, the attendees filed out with the measured pace of people carrying new responsibilities. Several officers stopped to ask follow-up questions, to request copies of protocols, to discuss implementation timelines. For the first time in my career, my technical expertise was being treated as mission-critical rather than administrative detail. I packed up my materials slowly, watching the room empty. The navy blue folder felt different now, not like a burden of invisible work, but like documentation of necessary knowledge finally being recognized. Outside, dusk was settling over the base, with the particular golden light that makes everything look like a memory in progress. I walked toward the flight line, drawn by the familiar sight of aircraft lined up like sleeping giants. The jets sat silent in their rows, waiting for tomorrow's missions. Some would carry the pilots trained under new protocols, guided by safety systems that had been updated, monitored by personnel who understood the weight of technical warnings. "Megan." I turned to find my father walking toward me, something in his hand, catching the last light of day. He stopped beside me, both of us facing the flight line in the gathering darkness. "I wanted to give you this," he said, holding out a photograph. It was a family portrait, recent, based on Rachel's shorter haircut and the lines around my mother's eyes. All of us in civilian clothes standing in front of the same house where I'd grown up, feeling invisible. But this time I was in the center, not pushed to the side or cropped out for better composition. Right in the middle between my parents, with Marcus and Rachel flanking us on either side. "We took another one," my father said quietly. "You're in this one." I took the photograph, feeling its weight. Such a small thing, glossy paper, captured light frozen moment. But it represented something larger, the acknowledgement of presence, the recognition of belonging, the simple fact of being seen. "Mom's idea," he added. She said the other photos never looked right, said something was always missing. I smiled, not because the gesture erased years of invisibility, but because it acknowledged them. "Thank you," I said. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Two soldiers at the end of a long day, finally understanding each other. In the distance, the base's lights began to flicker on the electrical grid, humming to life, keeping everything running through another night. Invisible work made manifest in illumination. Tomorrow I would go back to my consulting projects, my technical reports, my quiet expertise. Rachel would continue her retraining, learning to value the work that happened in shadows. My family would carry new understanding of what it meant to serve without seeking spotlight. But tonight I held a photograph that proved I had always been there. If you've ever been told your work doesn't count, if your silence was mistaken for absence, leave a comment below. Sometimes we carry entire systems on our back and still get told we were never there. But we were, we still are. And sometimes, if we're patient enough, the world finally learns to see what was always holding it together.